Good morning, everybody. I think we can slowly start. I have an honor and a pleasure to introduce you to this, I'm certain, very interesting session on sustainable mobility in urban areas, where we will have two interesting projects. My name is Piotr Apacz. I coordinate urban mobility team in DG Move in the European Commission. And to my right, you can see Karen van Kloijsen, Secretary General of Police, who will, together with me, moderate this session. We have two very interesting projects, Park for Samp and Sunplus. We will learn more about them in a minute, so I will not talk too much about that. What I can say is how they relate and how they fit into the EU policy, in particular EU urban mobility policy, which in fact is quite fresh. In December last year, we have adopted a new urban mobility policy called Urban Mobility Framework, which is naturally kind of an operationalization of the European Green Deal and the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy. So European Green Deal announced, among other things, that transport must become much less polluting, especially in cities. And therefore, in the urban mobility framework, we are focusing to support cities in making the sustainable mobility a reality and making it well ahead of 2050. So transport in cities should be not only less polluting, but also smarter, safer, more inclusive, etc. You can see that the common part of the project is an abbreviation called SUMP, S-U-M-P, which stands for Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning. And this is the core concept of our approach, of the EU urban mobility policy. And this is also what we have proposed in the urban mobility framework of last year. We will be coming up with a number of actions in this year and next year to make this more concrete. So, for example, this year we will adopt as a Commission a recommendation addressed to Member States that will include an updated concept of sustainable urban mobility planning, SUMP, as well as recommendations for Member States how to better support cities and put in place kind of a supportive framework for them to prepare, implement, and finance urban mobility projects. For the first time also in December, we have proposed some legal obligations for cities when it comes to actually sustainable urban mobility planning. So the 10T regulation, our proposal for the 10T regulation now includes the requirements that cities above 100,000 inhabitants should have in place their own sustainable urban mobility plans by 2025. And we hope it will pass through the co-legislators phase. Maybe I stop here and I present you distinguished speakers. To my left, you can see Peter Jones, who is a professor of environmental governance at UCL, as well as transport and sustainable development. In his work, he explores different aspects of urban mobility, especially when it comes to its impact on human health and livability in cities. And he has been involved in numerous projects financed by the EU that revolve around urban mobility. To his left, Charlotte Halpern, who is a researcher in the Center of European Studies and Political Scientists in Sciences Po in Paris. She specializes in urban matters and manages territorial governance and urban development. And to my far left, Patrick Auvergne, who works in Mobile 21 in Leuven. He's a coordinator of Park for Samp project, and he has been also involved in other urban mobility projects in the past. So without further ado, I give floor to Patrick, who will tell us about results of a Park for Some project, which focuses on pretty challenging aspect of transport and mobility in our cities, namely parking, as you can imagine, which is often a challenge. And I'm curious to learn what the project can tell us how to better manage this process. Patrick, floor is yours.
Thank you very well, Piotr. I will be talking to you about parking management and how it relates to SUMP planning. So to start with, maybe well known for all of you who are car drivers, our cars are stationed most of the time, 95% of the time, we don't drive the car. This means that our cars are consuming a lot of urban space, which can also be used for other purposes. It's not only that, but if we park our car, sometimes we have to pay for it. In other cases or in other cities, countries, you even don't have to pay for it. So our car spaces are often very highly subsidized. And this is a very problematic situation when we are dealing with urban mobility. And this is really what Park for Some is looking about, because we want to turn parking and parking management into a sustainable measure, in fact, and I will explain what we did. So what are the key objectives of the project? First of all, we want to uplift parking management or parking strategy or parking from an operational, it was mainly an operational task, to a more strategic one. What does this mean? If we're looking at parking from an operational perspective, this means that we are looking to the supply side. When cars are increasing, when there will be more cars in a city, then often the reaction is we need to increase the supply of the parking spaces. This is a pitiful reaction that has led to an overcapacity in most cases. So we want to change that, and we want to make parking a strategic approach. And this we'll do by integrating it into SUMP policies. So we want parking to become a strategy within the SUMP. What does this mean? This means that we are starting from the SUMP vision, that we're also thinking of what objectives do we want to have with parking. Can it contribute to less congestion? Can it contribute to reduction of CO2 emissions, etc., etc.? This is the strategic approach. And finally, also, we, of course, will be implementing measures in all kinds of sorts. I will give you some examples later. We will be evaluating these measures, and the cycle starts again. Last but not least, we all know that parking is a very emotional topic. If we ask politicians, do you want to do something about the horrible parking situation in your city, then they often say, well, rather not, because it's very tricky, I will lose my voters, etc., etc. What we developed in Park for Some in the project is an audit tool which is called ParkPAT, which stands for Parking Policy Audit. So By that tool, we want to bring together people around the table and discuss the parking issue in a rational way, rather than the old emotional way, based on facts and figures. And from that park path outcome, we want to develop or improve the parking policies within our cities. So these are the main objectives of Park for Some. To give you a short introduction of the project, we have 22 partners. The core of them are cities, so we are dealing with public authorities, and the 6 remaining partners are expert partners coming from universities, consultancies, etc. The project almost ends. We had an extension due to COVID with 6 months, so this means that the project will end of August this year. We had a budget of 3.5 million, and our main activities are, first of all, political awareness raising. What I told you, parking is not only emotions, but parking should be a strategy and should get a rational approach. It's also about capacity building. We develop trainings, etc. I will tell you later. But it's also about 16 cities that will be implementing parking measures and that will be evaluating them and also, of course, monitoring them. We are also looking to what innovations can bring parking to cities, and of course, we want to expand the outcomes of our project to more cities, to more European cities. If we're talking about real targeted impact, our 16 cities, they will integrate, of course, that's the first objective, parking management into their SUMPs. They will try to free 10% public space. For example, for one city, they might be targeting to reducing 2,000 on-street parking places. That might be a concrete target. We also try to encourage them to dedicate at least 10% of their parking revenues, their incomes from parking, to other sustainable mobility measures. And this is a principle which is called earmarking. I will explain it later. These 16 cities, at the end, they will have at least implemented 50 good parking management practices, and we are far beyond that, I can tell you. And of course, our objectives, they also contribute to the new Green Deal, to the carbon neutral cities objectives. So we will be all measuring these outcomes. We're not only working with the cities, but we are also working with national governments, because we found out in the analysis phases that legislation within countries is sometimes counterproductive if we're dealing with sustainable parking, or if we want to deal with that. So we also want to work with the national level so that we can discuss with them and facilitate measures or legislation that hinders, in fact, effective parking management in cities. And the transferability of the outcomes towards 300 more cities is also a concrete targeted impact of Park for Some. What were our main activities that we have realized in the starting phase of the project? We had this analysis both on the city level and on the national level. we had 20 national trainings. We worked together with other projects, but also with several institutional organizations like the CVNets, the EPOM constitutions. So there was a lot of cooperation, and it's still ongoing. You can see what trainings will become in the next months at our website. We have tested this ParkPath audit that we have developed in the project within our 16 cities, and we are now working on the exploitation. This means that we are building a kind of business plan for it, so that beyond the project, the ParkPath will last and can also be done with other cities. We had a communication dissemination strategy, and we are working at policy recommendations. We focus on two aspects. The first one is parking standards, and the second one is EV charging and parking. And at the end of the project, Park for Sump will also write a new SUMP 2.1 topic guide on parking and SUMP integration. I will show you very quickly some of the examples of what cities have been implementing. One of our cities in Spain is Vitoria-Gasteiz. They have a long tradition in SUMP, but what is worth knowing is that for building a new tram line, they reduced 2,000 parking spaces on this main square. So this is the first example. A second example from Belgium itself, it's the city of Sint-Niklaas, rather a small city. Here we worked with neighborhood and we facilitated together with the citizens changes in the urban space. Like, for example, here it's a school surrounding where we took away the parking spaces and we created a very nice environment for the children and the parents. Sint-Niklaas has also a long tradition of having a big market square, the biggest of Belgium, and in the 1660s it was only parking space. This is their ambition. So within 10 years it should become a green space and it should become the heart of a livable city. Park for Sump is also working on innovations, I've been telling, and in combination with enforcement, some cities introduced the technology of the scan car. It's not only about the scan car, but also about how do you gather data, how do you process data. The interoperability of data becomes very important in parking and can be used very well. Of course, a big challenge is the EV charging. We had two cities that are dealing far ahead with that. It's the city of Trondheim in Norway, but it's also city of Lisbon in Portugal. And you know, we don't want all the cables from the chargers on the street, so we have to think about it. We also have to think about the national grids, etc., etc., fast loading stations. Last but not least, the earmarking principle, which means can we reuse revenues from parking into sustainable mobility. And the city of Kraków in Poland, they demonstrated that. It's good to know that in Poland they have a national law that makes this become true, that cities have the possibility. And in Kraków, at least 65% of the incomes from parking is spent only or respent into sustainable measures, in fact. And of course, during the Park for Sump project, we also faced the COVID situation. We did an impact assessment, and one of the good things we saw that in terms of removing parking spaces from the streets, this accelerated in a kind of way due to COVID. So parking spaces were removed, there were terraces in place, etc. So this is an example of Rotterdam, but there are many cities that are doing this. And now I come to the end, Piotr. On the long term, we expect the ParkPad tool to become a real network of cities that have implemented or that have worked with the ParkPad. We will roll out our experience towards more cities in Europe, but we also have challenges, like there's the broad challenge of the curbside management in general, EV charging, the interoperability of data, mobility standards, so going from minimum standards, for example, to maximum standards. Also the take-up of the earmarking principle that can work better in many countries, but also the political guts of our decision makers that should say, well, we make parking an issue and we integrate it in our sustainable urban mobility plans. And in that way, sustainable parking can become a real game changer for resilient cities in the future, and thus also be beneficiary to the Commission's objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this very interesting presentation and quite revealing examples from the participating cities. Just want to mention that there will be, of course, time for questions and answers after the second presentation. I would just like to mention that both projects, and you could see it also on the slides, I think, are Civitas branded. Civitas is our EU-funded initiative under Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020 before, which brings together cities that would like to implement innovative urban mobility solutions projects together. So you could see numerous cities from different countries participating. And Civitas is also part of our EU urban mobility policy, and we will further strengthen Civitas initiative in the coming years. But now I give floor to our speakers that will tell us about the second SUMP-related project, Sunplus, and Charlotte Halpern will take floor first. Charlotte.
Thank you, Piotr and Karen, for the kind introduction. So let me tell you about the Sunplus project, which is an exciting project that we've been working on together with Peter Jones. We've decided that I would be delivering the presentation this morning. Peter will be talking about more projects in the next session, in which we've both been involved, so we decided to share the work among us. So Sunplus is for short for Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning, Pathways and Links to Urban Systems. This project acknowledges the fact that in order to develop a SUMP and why cities should develop it, there still are some areas where guidance can be usefully enhanced and also expanded. And this is what Sunplus focuses on. And more precisely about 3 different objectives. The first one is about the imperative to achieve zero carbon mobility. The second objective on which Sunplus acknowledged there is need for further guidance is the opportunities to collaborate with private companies and other economic sectors. And I will come back to this in a moment. It's also about the need to include guidelines on specific aspects of SUMP implementation, because we all heard about beautiful SUMPs in terms of plans and objectives that have been implemented only in a limited way. And this is something that we put at the center of this project. So as part of Sunplus, we're working together with 6 cities who provide laboratories to test new concepts and methods that have been developed by the 15 partners across 9 countries across Europe, and as part of this 3.5-year project, which is led by the city of Antwerp, we've focused on several objectives that I will introduce right away. No. Okay. Here I am, learning to use the tool. All right, so in terms of the objectives, we have 4 different policy objectives as part of this project. First, to develop and apply a set of context-specific mobility transformation pathways with a specific focus on small and medium-sized cities in order to move away from the large cities that we focused on over the past few years, past decade, I should say, and trying to acknowledge the fact that some of the challenges as part of decarbonation more specifically, we also have to include some of those medium and small-sized cities. A second policy objective that we're addressing as part of Sunplus has to do with demonstrating how cities can develop stronger links with other urban system components, such as health, such as education, but also tourism and logistics as being 4 key economic sectors that we've addressed and targeted as part of this project. A third policy objective has to do with identifying and demonstrating new partnerships and business models in order to strengthen the way through which those initiatives are being funded, and try to understand and go across the multi-level financing structures, but also to reach out to the private sector and think about new business models. And we're also focusing on identifying new solutions as part of those policy objectives. There also are some 4 operational objectives, which have been addressed mainly in partnership with our city partners in Sunplus, in order to develop and implement enhanced governance arrangements and advanced analytics in order to develop these initiatives, to extensively engage with citizens, with visitors and businesses, which is a second major operational challenge for a number of cities in Europe in order to address decarbonization. And as part of Sunplus, we also aim at delivering Sunplus guidance and to maximizing awareness and impact. So those are the main objectives. And let me tell you now how we've started working on this. We are now entering the last year of a project, so we already have quite a number of tools and methods and findings that have been developed, and this is what I would like to focus on. The first thing we focused on as part of a project, and this is part of the work that has been mainly led by UCL and my colleague Peter Jones, but also with Emilia Smets, has been to focus on what we call the challenge, which is namely to have some strategic planning for a 20 to 30 years horizon. This is a challenge that a number of cities have been facing, and as part of Sunplus, we have developed a new strategic planning approach in which the starting point is the vision of the desired future city, which is anchored in a holistic, long-term strategy for urban development, taking into account a number of urban systems and components, but also working with some backcasting methods in order to trace a pathway backwards from the vision to the present and include all the different sets of constraints that cities will face on the process in order to account for them, and also to ensure that cities, while addressing their vision on carbon neutrality and meeting 2030 and 2050 EU climate targets, also include other objectives such as Vision Zero. We've mentioned it before in Patrick's presentation, but also issues related to well-being or air quality that can then be included in the way through which the policy mix that is being designed and reconfigured and adjusted over time will help contribute to delivering the vision eventually. The second aspect we've been focusing on in Sunplus and developing some new concepts and methods and tools has to do with pathways and links. And I will come back to this in a minute and explain how different cities and the 6 cities in Sunplus have been addressing those 2 different issues. But what we acknowledge as part of Sunplus is that there is a need to support cities in delivering on their SUMP and more specifically at implementation stage. And in order to do that, we propose to focus on two different dimensions. On the one hand is how the pathway is being first developed, conceived, but also implemented. And this is where some of the work has been taking place with major transport service providers. This is led by our partner, UITP. But there's a second aspect which links together with what we call links in this project. So linkages between mobility and other economic sectors in the city, such as health, such as education, but also tourism and logistics. And in this particular case, we have been working with trip generating sectors, trying to understand and to identify what could be avoid measures, some measures that could support the shift towards achieving carbon neutrality, and envisaging new solutions in order to enhance and accelerate the process through which cities are going through. In order to do this, and because we're also working with cities of similar size, I've mentioned medium-sized and small-sized cities, we've been also liaising together with our partner Space Syntax in order to develop some analysis and data analytics about the networks and the urban structures in each of those cities, and see how cities with lower levels of density, cities which have maybe less developed public transport networks, could also be involved in the process and develop some ambitious vision and implementation strategies in order to deliver on those projects. And as a result, we've also worked together with our partner ICLE in order to develop what we call the city typology, in which we try not to focus so much on issues such as density, for example, or size. And we acknowledge that small-sized cities, medium-sized cities have also generated some pioneers within their groups which are delivering ambitious projects in terms of implementation strategies and the vision for 2030 and 2050 goals. And in order to better understand what mechanisms are lying behind that, we've worked on the city typology in order to identify what could be the specific needs of those small and medium-sized cities. A third focus of Sunplus has been to focus, as I said and mentioned before, on implementation, to support cities in not just developing and producing a vision, but also in managing the way through which implementation will unfold. And this is part of the bigger challenge, in a sense. If we have some 30 to 50 years long planning taking place, we all know that a number of disruptive factors may come into the way, either that have to do with economic factors, could be political factors and political change. We can also think about new technologies coming in the way. So the management of implementation is absolutely critical as part of the thinking that we're developing in Sunplus. And in order to support implementation planning and management, we propose 5 different tools that we've been developing as part of the project and working in close combination with the 6 cities. The first one is a policy mix carbon reduction tool that has been developed by our colleagues from Vectos and Steve Wright, more specifically, which focuses on maximizing the scale of each policy measure mix's carbon reduction impact. And here the main idea is to clearly identify what are the solutions that should be avoided at all costs because of their high level in terms of carbon emission, and to identify what shifting measures but also new solutions could be developed along the way and introduced in the policy mix as they are being developed and identified. Vectos, and this is Tim Durant, has been developing a budget tracker and a financial framework tool in order to upscale and leverage opportunities. And here we acknowledge the fact that a lot of the budget in order to support implementation will not just come from cities. It will be multi-level. Some of it will draw on regional budgets. It will draw on national states. It will draw on the EU. And so there is a need for cities to have a tool, a financial budget tracker, in order to identify where those opportunities lies, when in the process, and to be able, while identifying those opportunities, to bring this coherent and integrated budget to support their needs. Myself from Sciences Po, we've been working more specifically on capacity building and governance arrangement. Governance is not just something that is going to be there at the very beginning and never move along the way, because since this project, and especially in terms of delivering the vision by 2030 and 2050 is quite ambitious, it will have some transformative impact on the way through which a city is governed. For example, bringing together some municipal departments that didn't used to speak with one another. And we all have some experience of that in our home cities, creating the space in order for different stakeholders in order to discuss, to co-create, but also to negotiate how they're going to bring those needs further. So the Policy Resource and Governing Capacity Index has been a way to provide an up-to-date, a dynamic, a more qualitative assessment to cities in order to support them in the process of identifying what their formal resources are and how they can link together with the private sector, citizen groups, but also with other levels of government in order to enhance those resources and create new capacities in the process of delivering their vision. Been working also at developing a set of engagement tools, and this is our colleagues from EIP in Bucharest who've been developing and supporting the continued engagement of citizens and stakeholders groups. And last but not least, we've been also working together with MEMEX on producing an evaluation methodology to assess the strategy intangible impact. So this is mainly the tools and the concept that we've been developing, but let me tell you a little bit about the cities we've been working with and how all those concepts and tools have been applied in those 6 ambitious co-creation city labs. We've been working in this project with 6 cities, Klaipėda City, Greater Manchester, Alba Iulia, Platanias, Antwerp and Lucca, sorry. In Klaipėda City, here the main focus has been to create some financial strategy in order to fund a core BRT measure, but more specifically to think about how the SUMP vision could be implemented. And apart from the core BRT measures, the city has also been working into supporting soft coordination modes at intermunicipal level in order to support the development of cycling lanes. In Greater Manchester, in the UK, we've been focusing on bringing together the health and the transport sectors in order to create a health and transport decarbonisation action plan and to align the priorities of both sectors, acknowledging the fact that by bringing those 2 economic sectors together in the way they plan their decarbonisation plan, this could have a more positive impact on the way through which the city can deliver its plan. Just going to quote a last example because I don't want to be too long, but maybe I could speak about Platanias in Greece, which is an island city which is characterized by high levels of seasonal tourism. And in the case of Platanias, we've been working together with the city in order to develop some guidelines for small cities in order to address the constraints of cities of this size and to support in order to work together with stakeholders at the local level, but also with the national government and the Greek national government and the regional government of Crete in order to support a more seasonal approach to how the SUMPs could be delivered. Coming now to the impact and how we are now thinking about extended coverage and to exploit the project knowledge, we are proposing to develop a topic guide on transition pathways and implementation strategies in which we will bring together the different concepts and tools that we've been developing as part of Sunplus. We're also thinking about to propose practitioners' briefings on cross-sectoral links, especially working together with the City of Greater Manchester, with the health sector, with Antwerp on logistics, with Lucca on retail and logistics, in order to increase accessibility and use mobility more efficiently and equitably across those different economic sectors. Sunplus tools will also help to assist smaller cities. I've mentioned the case of Platanias. We could also speak about Alba Iulia in Romania, which has been also part of this endeavor. We will also work at encouraging peer learning through our follower cities groups, and we're developing a city consult agency, which we're currently working on together with ICLEI, where we will propose some long-term material that should be available for all users, but also with some tools for self-assessment, and that could be useful for cities in order to develop their tools. So coming to a conclusion, I would like now to explain what are the mid to long-term expected impact of the project. So one of them is the proposed SUMP topic guide on how cities can develop transition pathways to achieve carbon neutral mobility, while also meeting the other objectives I mentioned before, such as well-being and air quality. It will be submitted to the European Commission in autumn 2022 and should feed into, and we hope it will feed into future some guidance. We're also focusing on the new policy context in order to support and to advise cities in the way they want to achieve EU Green Deal, Fit for 55 and DG Move strategy. And with this, we are emphasizing the centrality of climate targets, but also acknowledging the fact that in order to meet those targets, there will be a need for much more radical measures than are already in place, and for strategic planning processes to be enhanced and better coordinated with one another. In terms of the transition pathways, we will be helping cities in developing the 20 to 30 years vision and to support them through the different tools we've been producing. So the transition pathway, the policy mix, focusing also on the strategic policy timeline and the financial budget tracker. And I just want to finish with the cross-sector links and partnerships, which is one of the added value of the Sunplus project, and more specifically arguing that in those cities where the transition pathway is already well underway, some considerable new opportunities at reducing carbon impact can be found in enhancing cooperation between different economic sectors. So bringing together cross-sectoral links and enhancing partnerships with the private sector, with different stakeholders in the city, will help sectors to take responsibility for and action to eliminate transport-related carbon emissions that their business practice generate, and in this process support the efforts of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this very interesting presentation with a lot of concepts and tools presented. And now the time has come for questions and answers, and I hope there's going to be an interesting discussion, which will be moderated by Karen. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Piotr, and good morning, everyone, also from my side. So basically, the floor is open to your questions, either to Patrick for the Park for SUMP presentation, or to Charlotte and Peter on Sunplus. So anyone who would like to ask a question, no need to be shy. Yes, here in front, well, on the third row. And please introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lucian Zagan from Eurocities. A question for Patrick, but maybe I'll start with a comment that connects a bit the two projects. So Charlotte mentioned those contexts in which SUMPs might not deliver the impact expected. And I come from Romania. I did my study in Bucharest, and all our studies on the ground were on Bucharest. And what it came all the time is that you cannot even talk about sustainable urban mobility project if you don't manage parking. So that would have been the starting point. So for cities that have their parking well managed, maybe it's easy to miss how important parking is, but it's really key to sustainable urban mobility planning. And now the question. So I think the question is about what a parking policy is supposed to do. And I think here there is a tension between reducing car use, reducing space for cars, and making it available for more sustainable modes. And here, quite often, I think it's not the first time I say it, there is a title I really like in a book, which is Cycling Policy is Parking Policy. So the question is, how does this tension between reducing car use and making parking efficient and available for those that need it came up in Park for SUMP?
Well, maybe first to comment on the countries that you mentioned that maybe are not progressed very far in their parking policies, and especially in integrating them in their SUMP. That's true, but when Park for SUMP also works with these countries, because in Romania we have Slatina, We have Skadar, which is a middle-sized city in Albania. We have other cities that are not progressed very far in parking policies. But what we also always start from the analysis. What did you do on parking? Was there already parking regulation? Was there control? Was there paid parking, etc.? And from that, if there's not, you really have to start there at the real bottom, at the start, and make them convinced that introducing controlled parking on the streets is very important. Maybe some areas in the inner city where you introduce paid parking becomes important. And we realize that it's not very interesting for policymakers in the cities, certainly in these countries. We face it in Slatina. When there were elections, all the promises went down again. So I recognize, and that's why I also mentioned at the end of my presentation, what we really have to work on is political buy-in. So there's a need for political guts also at the local level to make sure that parking becomes really more not only a matter of supply, but also integrating them in your SUMP, starting from where do you want to go with your city, what's your vision, what are your objectives, and how can parking contribute to that. The second question, can you repeat it again?
It's a bit what a parking policy is supposed to do, and how do you match this maybe conflicting things about reducing car use and actually parking policy being key for other sustainable urban mobility measures, and making parking, I don't know, available and efficient for those that need it?
Yeah. What we say within Park for Sump is that parking policy can help to reduce car use. The parking management is not only about the supply side, but also working at the demand side. So working on behavior, the stick and the carrot approach, in fact, and well, we know this is not always popular, but it needs to be done. Paid parking is really very common in most cities, and even paid parking doesn't pay the price of what really the parking costs. So we need to work on the real costs and make people aware what is the real cost of parking. There doesn't exist free parking. That doesn't exist. People will have to pay for parking in the future everywhere, I think. And we need to make sure that parking, that on-street parking will be reduced and can make room for other sustainable transport modes, like in the example of Vitoria-Gasteiz. There's a tram line, but also in other cities, parking spaces can be reduced and make space for bike lanes, for example. Park for Some also did look at bike parking policies, because this is also important when we are talking about integrating it into our SUMP. Also, bike parking has an important place, and also standards for that. How do you manage it? This all is part of Park for Some. I brought 3 brochures already with me, so if the public is interested, it's one on enforcement, it's one on the political buy-in, the good reasons, and it's one on the parking standards of Park for Some.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And indeed, what it comes down to is that we need to rebalance the way we use our space in cities and reallocate space more fairly, and that definitely includes questioning the space given to parking. I see another hand going up there. Yes?
This is Ahmet Duran from TOG, Turkish Electric Vehicle OEM. My question is related with the previous question. I think the parking space is highly related with the vehicle usage and ownership. So mostly for private cars, I think I can think. So will you connect your studies with some kind of mobility as a service concept? Because if the cars are shared and not private, then you don't need to park. So this can like work, closed loop and in shuttleways, all those parks. So is there any plan to connect these studies with MaaS or mobility as a service solutions?
Yes, this is already ongoing. I think when we are dealing with mobility hubs, the car sharing and the aspect of the parking is in many cases is included there. So how do we manage it? How do we regulate it? And I think also, well, there's some guidance already. I think at the European level, there's many projects that are working on that, but also on the regional level. In many countries, these mobility hubs or mobility points, like they include parking for shared mobility also. Yes.
And in addition, also MaaS applications are exploring whether parking as such can be integrated also in a MaaS environment. Also putting forward the price of what it means if you would still consider using your private car, but it's definitely being explored. Very interesting question. I saw another hand, yes, on the third row, on the right side.
Good morning. My name is Peter Mörtel with Virtual Vehicle, and I had a question that relates to a discussion that started yesterday. It has to do with the role of self-driving or automated driving vehicles to support sustainable mobility in cities. Because at first hand you may think adding additional cars, self-driving cars, may not be much of a benefit, but if you think of self-driving cars potentially enabling shared mobility, a vehicle driving to the passenger, picking up the passenger, then finding its parking lot, doing self-charging and so on. So maybe so I was wondering about your view on self-driving vehicles possibly enabling future mobility solutions and sustainable solutions.
I think it could potentially be a question for all of you. Any views that you would like to share? Pete?
Okay, thank you. I think there are several aspects to this. On the one hand, yes, how might autonomous vehicles be used? And there are sort of three ways, really. One is they just replace private cars, so the person still owns the car, but they just sit back and the car drives itself. That means potentially the trips don't become very different, although there's a bigger market because elderly people or younger people would be able to use their own car, which they can't at the moment if they don't have a driving license. You can get rid of the problem of city centre parking by having dropped the person off the car, then goes back home or somewhere else, but then you're substituting parking pressure in the city centre with extra mileage, kilometrage. That's the first option. The second option, it just replaces a taxi. So essentially it's the same as ordering a taxi or Uber now, but it'll be cheap, half the price because you won't have the driver. And the third option is that it actually encourages shared mobility. And a lot of people have actually said that they felt it would promote shared mobility, but I must admit I'm a bit doubtful about that because at the moment, there's Uber Share and there are ways in which you can save some money by having a shared ride, but most people still want a personal ride. And when you go to autonomy and the costs halve anyway, the incentive sharing will become less in absolute terms than it is now. So I think this idea that it'll all be a wonderful shared future, I'm not quite sure about that, to be honest.
I think it will be instrumental.
Sorry.
So it will be instrumental in going forward that cities really think about the way in which they want to allow automated cars in their urban cores and set the rules of the game, basically. Electrified, shared would be two important conditions, I think. Yes, here on the second row.
Hi, I'm from Logica Field Labs. My name is Mehmet Golhan. My question is about, I think, what the gentleman here also asked and everybody else talked about. There's a lot of emphasis on supply side, innovating new products, but when it comes to governance, focusing on the demand side, how do you actually put conditions and pricing into how these new electric cars, etc., are used? There seems to be a major gap. How are we going to tackle this problem? If it's so difficult to change pricing in a parking spot, it is equally difficult to charge people on the roads for the kinds of usage they're doing. There are many examples of properly functioning markets in financial markets or in mobile data networks, etc. But there is nothing in transport market that charges people according to the usage. If a car is an electric car, if it's shared, if it's parking, maybe you should pay less than a car which is larger and not shared. Or entering into the city road with a huge empty car, you should pay more. If you have a full bus, you should pay less. If you have an empty bus, you should be penalized with a huge payment. This kind of dynamic pricing and governance is absolutely possible. Many examples of it in all other industries, except transport. Why is it that transport is resisting this? What kind of a mechanism there needs to be changed? Despite billions of euros being spent on innovation, when it comes to simple policy governance, what is lacking? How can we break this?
It's a very sensitive issue, clearly. Any of the speakers who would like to reflect on this?
Yeah, I can only mention a few examples in parking. Well, in many cities, there's differentiated parking tariffs, which means there's tariffs when you go to the inner city, when you drive there and you will need a parking space there, then it will cost you a lot. The more you go to the outskirts, the more it becomes cheaper. But then even not, it's really the price of the parking spot. We know that. So I agree with you that that's what I emphasized before, that we still pay not enough for parking, even in a city, the cycling city of Copenhagen. Excuse me if there's maybe people from Copenhagen there, but even residents, they pay not so much for parking their car there. So it's really true. I think we need to look at the real price, but indeed you also have to look at social mechanisms that makes it payable for all people also, and also people that don't drive the car, so there can be redistributing mechanisms incorporated, and that's cities that have to work on, but also national governments can stimulate or facilitate that.
So let me just explain how the mics work. Don't push the button, because when you push it, you switch it off with the other people. So over to Peter, and all of a sudden we have all speakers who would like to say something on this very hot topic. Peter.
If I get this right, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, the whole issue about road pricing, in a sense, or congestion charging, I mean, it's been around for 60 years, and it's not a technical problem, it's a political and governance type problem. What's changed is in the UK, for example, we have limited examples. The first one was actually in Durham, in northeast England, but the one that everybody knows is London. That took a very brave politician to actually introduce. There was lots of pressure not to do it from Parliament, ministers, everything. And he insisted, and it was very successful. What's changed, though, is that there's now a serious concern, it must apply throughout Europe, that it was always being led by a Department of Transport, but now it's being led by the Treasury, because the Treasury realised that over the next 10 or 15 years, they're going to lose something like £25 billion a year in revenue from fuel duty, because nobody will have cars. So that really focuses minds. And when it gets down to serious money, that tends to have a higher political weight. So there is that discussion now, but it's really being led by the Treasury. And the second thing I'd say, really going back to Charlotte's presentation, she briefly talked about the idea about avoid, shift and improve. And most of the work we're talking about is on shifting people out of cars or improving electrification. But I think the real win, as Charlotte hinted, was on the avoid side. And if we can work with other sectors that actually generate the demand for travel, then there's a possibility of reducing trip lengths and trip numbers, and that will also take pressure off the whole system. Very simple example, Greater Manchester, one of the districts there, the health sector looked at how they delivered home care services, nurses, social workers going to the home, and each of them went all over the borough, and they reorganised it so they had a local catchment area each, and that meant most of them didn't need to drive anymore and try and find parking spaces. They could walk or cycle, and they reduced trips a lot, and they increased the time that people spend with their patients. Well, that's really getting these other sectors to really look seriously at how they deliver and the role that mobility plays in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Piotr, from the Commission, you would like to say something about this as well?
Yes, maybe just quickly some personal observations that that maybe the part of the problem that we are not progressing fast enough, let's say, with kind of rationalizing the cost of parking lies in the either misunderstanding or still lack of awareness, both at the level of general population and also political leaders. Basically, whenever you talk to people about polluter pays principle and user pays principle, almost everybody is convinced that basically they are covering the cost of using the infrastructure because they own a car and they pay taxes. And people are often convinced that actually they pay more taxes than actually the real cost of usage of the infrastructure, including parking, actually amounts to. And if you tell people actually, no, you don't pay enough, there's a lot of negative externalities that are not accounted yet, usually they are very surprised. And I think this is one of the big reasons why political leaders are quite reluctant towards actually pushing in this direction, because basically they're just afraid of losing support of people. So I think there is still a big role to play of education, awareness raising, and actually political leaders to be bolder about communicating this harsh but reality.
Yeah, so internalizing external costs, the real costs, and indeed political leadership as always. Charlotte, some concluding comments?
Sorry, Karen. Yes, just two. I think this is a fascinating question. There are two things I'd like to add on this and what my colleagues here have been arguing. The first thing is that yes, the mechanisms exist. We know how to do it in theory. However, if it comes to practice, it means that there is some hard work that needs to be done, not just on political leadership, which is one thing that has been mentioned already, but also some governance reform. So it means to pay proper attention to how this will be enforced. And the two different aspects that have been discussed in the cities that we've been working on, especially as part of the MORE project, but also on Sunplus and Create, which we also worked on a few years ago. The first one is how cities relate with the national government. Peter's been mentioning the Treasury. There's not just the British Treasury that plays this growing role. This is something that we see everywhere in Europe, with the Finance Ministry taking place and a more important place in different negotiations taking place at the national level. But we can also think in terms of how far we've gone within the European context, in terms of decentralization reform and how autonomous cities are in order not just to think about what vision they want for the 2030, 2050 years time, but also what are the concrete resources that they can draw upon on two different aspects. First, do they own their streets? And we found out in the MORE project that indeed they don't own most of the streets. So that's one thing. And the second aspect that we found is also that in many cases, if you want to introduce these pricing mechanisms, it means that a city needs to talk to its neighbors and to find a space in order to do this in a more formal way. So there, again, it requires some governance arrangements. So I think my answer to you is, yes, the mechanism exists, but it means that there needs to be proper attention, resources, efforts being made into having a bold reform of administrative systems, which is the less sexy possible theme ever for any politician.
The right competence at the right level, indeed. Yes. Question here.
Thank you. I had a question, sorry, Josephine Darlington, Drive Sweden. I had a question in regard to the tools and the strategies that were mentioned by Charlotte. And I was wondering if you looked into if the cities already have roles or need to recruit to be able to implement, develop and sustain the different SUMPs you've been talking about. Especially as you've looked into small and medium-sized cities, which we see, for example, in Sweden, there's usually one person overwhelmed with all of these different questions. Have you looked into that aspect?
Yes, we did. This is a major issue. Well, for medium and small-sized cities, I would tend to argue also with larger cities who found that human resources and how they're being managed in order to take into account a more holistic approach to mobility and transport has been quite a challenge, even for large cities. And this was the findings that we had in the CREATE project, working on Paris and London and Copenhagen that we've mentioned before. So in the context of those small-sized cities and medium-sized cities, the situation that we found is that in many cases, the development of SUMPs has been externalized to consultancy firms or to universities, to a broad number of actors. Now, I don't have anything to say against this type of stakeholders, but it means that in many aspects, city governments don't learn in the process, and just one person finds itself in charge of implementing it afterwards, and part of the larger problem is then how to develop those resources. So we've accompanied and we're working together with the city of Alba Iulia at this moment, or the city of Platanias in Greece, or the city of Klaipėda in Lithuania, in order first to support them in structuring a SUMP working group, not just bringing together expertise that may already be existent at city level, but also identifying what could be workable spaces in which to draw out to expertise being, for example, available at the regional level, or to set up some connections and some more formalized linkages together with the national government, for example, or with the other stakeholders in the area. So this is one of the things that we've been working on. The second aspect that we've been working on is training, and this is why we developed the City Consult Agency, working together with ICLEI. There's a major need throughout Europe to bring capacity through that transport and mobility sector in order to train, to support, to develop and to disseminate the new tools and the very interesting projects that are being led and supported by the EU, but to put this into capacity. And this is something that university, for example, need to focus on, and with some courses that really are focusing for practitioners. And this is what my colleagues at EIP, for example, have been doing as part of Fast Track capacity program in order to support cities in this process. So those would be the two answers.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think, yes, indeed, over there.
This is Pietro Perlo from IFES, Italy. Mobility is characterized by the so-called quasi-invariance. You know, people move 1 hour a day, on average, in the last 4 or 5 centuries. The average speed of cars measured in the last 100 years is always 35 kilometers per hour. People travel 2% more every year because modality changes, but this is a sort of invariant, 2% more a year. In Italy, there is a very nice statistic that I made myself. The number of asphalted roads increased, but also the number of cars. So we passed from 1 car every 100 meters of asphalted road to 1 car every 15 meters. The suspect, because you were talking about parking, is that also the parking space per person is a sort of an invariant. Do you have any data on how the parking spaces evolved in the last 100 years? Why I'm saying that the suspect is that this is also an invariant or quasi-invariant. Yes, you may pass from cars to bikes. You may impose something in the regulations to avoid parking somehow, but air mobility will change again the rules. And the parking space needed, if you move to personal air mobility may increase, and then the invariant will remain. So do you have any study of how the parking space evolved in the last 100 years and how perhaps may evolve in the next 50?
Any numbers on that, Patrick?
I'm afraid I have to let you down because I don't have any numbers on studies, but I can imagine that nowadays parking spaces become bigger because there's larger cars, like we have the SUVs, etc. And it becomes a problem certainly for on-street parking, also because we need more space there, and the space is limited. On the other hand, I think that you started with the example that also our parking spaces come closer. I don't know what you mean, but we have the example of Vitoria-Gasteiz, where in the super blocks, probably you know them, they don't build parking spaces close to the apartments or to the housing, but they look at where are the public transport spots. If you want to have public transport competed with cars, then you have to make sure that your parking spots are at least further away than your bus stop is, for example. So, and this is what Vitoria-Gasteiz is working on. Also, our city in Sweden, Umeå, they have the concept that for new housing developments, they don't allow to have parking spots on the streets or in the housing blocks. But they make a deal with the developer and they create own parkings at the outskirts of the city. So even within walking distance, but not that it's very easy to take your car for every short trip.
So it all comes down to how space is being used and having better data in terms of taking stock of that and look at the allocation and also reallocation. So maybe, Piotr, you can say a few words about the indicators that have been developed by the European Commission, one of which relates to space usage.
Indeed, thanks, Karen. We had a pilot project in the European Commission called Sustainable Urban Mobility Indicators, SUMI, and that worked with cities from all EU member states, almost all of them. And now we are in the phase 2 of this project, where we are working kind of on improving the methodology of the indicators. But what I wanted to mention is that one of those indicators that we have already identified and which are accessible on our website, so DG Move website, SUMI, is the mobility space usage indicator. So this is an indicator that allows cities to actually check and have a direct, exact figure on the proportion of land use taken by all city transport modes, including direct and indirect use. So this is, of course, streets, but also on-street parking, for example. We don't have a dedicated indicator for parking as such, but maybe this indicator could be used as a proxy and to show the evolution of how this changes over time. Are cities going towards actually reducing or increasing the space used for cars? Thanks.
Thank you, Piotr. We've come to the end of this session, sadly. I have the feeling we could have gone on for a longer time. If you have any further questions, you can always address the speakers during the coffee break, which is now, and then we will reconvene at 11. In this room, there will be a session on sharing the space and the service, which I think is also very much linked to what we have already been discussing and will surely be a very interesting session as well. And before you go out, please join me in a round of applause for our speakers, and also thank you for engaging actively.
And also a word from the organizers. You are, of course, warmly invited to the exhibition area outside, where you can see different stands of different projects, as well as the European Commission. Thanks a lot.